All right, guys, welcome to Lecture 2 of the Reading Notes from McKay, and this is going to cover pages 338 to 352. We're going to jump right into it here. We're going to talk about challenges to the church as well as social changes in the later Middle Ages. First of all, we're going to talk about issues in the church, okay? As the plague swept through Europe, obviously people turned to the church for help. Medicine at the time was rudimentary at best. Science, experimentation were more or less completely ineffective in stopping the spread of the plague. So people looked to the church, that one sort of stabilizing factor in their lives. A lot of local priests and a lot of church officials did help and did give their lives to help plague victims. But at the same time, for a lot of peasants and poor people across Europe, the church actually sort of added to the burden of the plague by, continuing to demand tithes and all types of financial payments and services, or simply sort of barricading themselves into their monasteries and refusing to help plague victims. So to some degree, I think the plague hurt the church's reputation as a whole. On a bigger scale, during the sort of post-plague years, we see a massive rift in the church develop, and this is going to hurt the church even more, and I think ultimately lead to the Protestant Reformation. This period is known as the Babylonian captivity, and it's named after the biblical event where the Hebrews were held in Babylon for a period. So essentially, here's the story. King Philip the Fair of France in 1309 convinces the new pope to move the papacy from Rome, where it always had been, to France. Okay, so again, 1309, King Philip convinces the pope to move the papacy away from Rome into France. And his reasons were purely political. Okay, remember that the church had a lot of power. If Philip has the seat of the church there, he can control the church. He can influence their decisions. He can form basically probably what he sees as an unbreakable bond, and I think exert authority. And you guys have seen from your work in the medieval period, this constant struggle between church and crown is one of the main themes of the Middle Ages. Now, by 1378, okay, the papacy has moved back to Rome, and we get a new pope, and his name is going to be Urban VI. Urban VI sets out to reform the church. And when the papacy had been at Avignon, it was really more bureaucratic in nature. It was really more interested in sort of worldly affairs and less so in spiritual affairs. It was a business. So Urban really wants to get the church back to its roots, so to speak. So one of the first things that he does when he takes over is try to institute reforms, and he starts to attack the luxurious lifestyle of a lot of the archbishops and cardinals, that he sees as averse to the mission of the church. Unfortunately for Urban, a lot of the cardinals and archbishops take umbrage to this attack, and they set out to undermine him. So what they wind up doing is they select a new pope, a rival pope, and they set him up, Clement VII, in Avignon. Okay, so at this point, we're going to have two popes, Pope Urban in Rome and Clement in Avignon, France again, okay? And this period is known as the Great Schism, and it begins in 1378, and what we're going to see is a massive division in Europe, really based along political lines as to where the loyalties go. Like, for instance, France is going to back the Avignon Pope. England, for obvious reasons, in the midst, again, of the 100-Year War with France, is going to back the Pope in Italy. Scotland, right? Always at war with England. They're, of course, going to back the French Pope, and so on and so on and so on. So the lines are drawn along those political lines. And you can see how this is going to weaken the authority of the church. When you have, there are two popes, they're excommunicating each other. Different kings are telling their subjects, hey, this is the person that you're supposed to listen to. It really undermines the authority of the church, and that stability that the church had offered for hundreds of years is sort of taken away. Out of this turmoil, we start to see voices rise up that are critical of the church. One of the most important is an Englishman named John Wycliffe. Wycliffe talks about the importance of Scripture to Christians, and questions, the role of the Pope in that. Like in other words, he kind of comes out with the idea there should maybe be a direct line between Christian faithful and the Scripture alone. Um, his followers are known as lollards. It's sort of a derogatory term, but they teach women to preach and allow for them to preach, and they play a significant role in the movement. Um, Lollards are going to kind of come and go. Some take their mission to Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic. And one of the people that is sort of moved by this message of Wycliffe and the Lollards is a guy named Jan Hus. Huss is even more critical, and he sort of builds on Wycliffe to the point where he even gets into military conflicts with the Pope himself, founding his own church, the Hussite Church in Bohemia. It's named after him. Um, Eventually, the schism gets to such a terrible place that we wind up with three popes. A council appoints a new pope and tries to sort of knock off both the Roman Pope and the Avignon Pope. They won't go away so easily. So you have at the height of the Great Schism, I guess you'd say, three popes. Finally, this all gets sorted out by 1417 at the Council of Constance. Huss is put to death by fire for his heresy. The schism ends, and I think maybe most importantly at this conclave or meeting where this new pope is named Martin V, they miss a big opportunity, and that opportunity is to sort of reform some of the things that the church is doing that are really turning people off. A group, for instance, named the Conciliarists had favored limits on the Pope's power. They had wanted more collaborative rule, rather than just the Pope sort of ruling the church as a dictator. They don't really get any of that. And unfortunately, the church misses an opportunity at reform. I think maybe if they had sort of addressed some of the problems that they were having, some of the worldliness, some of the corruption, then perhaps the Reformation wouldn't have been such a lightning bolt to the church that it's going to wind up being, that we're going to get to in the coming days. Okay. But that is the end of the Great Schism. And again, you can see how this would weaken the church. I mean, all this division and questioning and so forth. Now, on to the life of the people. Remember that, in Europe, there are these disasters. The 100 Years' War and the Black Plague take a huge toll on people. France, the countryside where most of the battles of the 100 Years' War are fought, is in ruins. The English peasants are burdened by taxes that they're trying to use to pay for the cost of the war. We're going to see crime, economic hardship. We're going to see the beginnings of massive peasant uprisings. And then we're going to look sort of at village life and the role of the local church as the center for most people's day-to-day existence. So just into marriage, really quickly. Of course, marriage it's important now, and of course it was important then as well. Marriage and marriage life. I mean, still, this would determine a person's life partner, their economic prospects, and families would often seek economic and social advancement throughout or through marriage, I should say. Women would marry generally in their early 20s. A lot of people, especially in Northwestern Europe, felt like that people should be financially independent prior to being married. So this would lead to women being married later. This is not something I think we would normally picture. I mean, normally we picture, in times further distant in history, people getting married younger and younger, but that wasn't always the case. Men a lot of times would marry later than women, so you would see, so in other words, older men than younger women, but you would see basically mobs of unmarried young men in a lot of these European countries. The book discusses how prostitution was a public matter. In most of these places, it was regulated, but also tolerated, and it sort of did indicate what you might call a social tolerance for male sexuality. The book also discusses homosexuality, and it mentions a specific case study in Florence where they set up a committee to sort of sniff it out, those types of activities. But again, as with modern times, I mean, that type of activity was certainly going on. Right? All right. The church is, of course, going to play a key role in marriage. They're going to sanctify it and govern it. Divorce was basically non-existent at this time. And there were some questions over private marriages where individuals might quote unquote get married without without the church being involved.